The secret to successful decision-making, a blend of logic and emotion. Have you ever tried to put a point across or have an equitable discussion with your fellow workers, your partner, or your kids? What happens when you broach a subject that might be inflammatory for the people that you want to talk to? What happens when there are so many different personalities involved? When it comes to group agreement and harmony, several factors play a crucial role. Here are some of the important aspects to consider. Open and respectful communication is essential for fostering group agreement and harmony. Members should be encouraged to express their ideas, concerns and opinions without fear of judgment. Active listening and empathy are equally important in ensuring that everybody feels heard and understood. However, this is much more difficult than you think. How can you manage that fine line of harmony, respect, and meeting everybody's needs when making decisions with other people, your partner, or even your kids? I have news for you. There is a way. I'm Kate Mason and welcome to Parenting and Personalities. This is the podcast that connects you to the ones you care about the most. Today I'm talking to Robin Parsons. Robin's a certified professional facilitator, certified technology of participation facilitator. She has an MBA, a Bachelor of Commerce, and is a communications and advertising accredited professional. She's a strategic thinker and an experienced leader with 25 years under her belt, along with many other achievements. In 2014, she established a consulting and facilitation business called Parsons Dialogue. Her mission is to help groups think clearly so that they can make the decisions they need to make through the design and facilitation of great dialogue. Today we'll be discussing how we can learn to facilitate the important discussions that we have using the ORID method. Hello Robin and welcome to the show.
Hi, good to be here.
Now you've had a pretty amazing career so far. I've no doubt you've got plenty more things that you'd like to do. So what I'd love to know is, where did it all start? You know, this decision to help people through conversation, was it something that you hankered to do during childhood or adulthood, or did it just suddenly fall in somewhere?
I would say definitely fall in. Anytime you talk to a facilitator, we all have different paths to our present state, but mine was something like this. I had worked in business development and marketing and business intelligence and corporate strategy. And so in those functions, you always found yourself in a place where you had to get a group of people through a conversation.
Right.
And so I seemed to be comfortable in that space. I seemed to have a sort of, I'll call it an aptitude for that. And then in 2014, I was laid off. And then I had to decide, well, what does my next job look like? And I realized that I just didn't want to work the way I'd been working any longer. Mm-hmm. And then when I thought about what I enjoyed doing, I thought, well, I'd been doing this thing where I was running, executive meetings and leadership offsites. And I thought, that's kind of cool. I wonder if I could make a living at that. And so I decided to give it a go and do some training and get some certifications. And, 9 years later, here I am.
Wow. It's a great thing to do. It's a great talent to have. I mean, I know you can learn it, but there's certainly people that are really good at it innately. You obviously are a good listener as well.
You do have to learn how to listen. It's actually one of the things that makes it hard to do the work. When you're working with a group, you're listening on many levels. So you're listening to kind of, what is the group talking about? And then you're listening for, are they getting to where you want them to get to? And then you've got a conversation in your head going on about, how is the process working and do I need to change anything? It's one of the reasons at the end of the day, you're pretty bagged because you've done so many levels of listening and thinking.
Yeah, and making the right responses too, and directing the conversation in the right way. Now, on your website, you've got stuff about mediation, coaching as such. So are you more of a mediator? Do you prefer mediation or facilitation or a bit of both?
Yeah, I'm definitely a facilitator. So my business partner is the mediator in the crowd. And he does, when we get into sort of heavily conflicted work, that's where he'll take the lead. I have some mediation training, but I feel like I don't have great depth there. So I always work in partnership when we've got conflicted situations. So Definitely facilitator.
Yeah, great idea. So what's the difference? So, I mean, I do know, like I kind of have an idea, because I would hate to be a mediator. I find that whole thought very stressful. So what's the difference for you? Is it the problem solving or the anger or the whatever comes out of that?
I think the difference is just the amount of, I'm going to call it in the trenches work you do. The difference between mediation is, in mediation, there is a conflict that you're trying to resolve. And in facilitation, generally speaking, you're not in a conflicted state. You're trying to get some level of consensus or conclusion or decision, but it's not generally conflict forward, although you may have some conflict in the group. With mediation, there is a conflict. There are two parties or more in dispute, and they are looking for a process to get them through the dispute. And so the big difference, I think, the reason I'm less comfortable is really spending time in that translation of the person's position to trying to get to interests. So what is it that's really important to them? And that's not often what's on the surface in a conflict, right? And, my neighbor's fence is the wrong color. Well, that's not actually the interest. The interest might be is I have a tremendous regard for, the aesthetic of my property, right? And that's the interest that we're trying to maintain, right? And trying to solve for.
Mm-hmm. No, I get that. I was mediating my children last night, and I thought, I really need to talk to Robin today.
And we're not impartial in that situation either. No, that's the hard part.
No, that's the really hard part. So we're going to look at something called the ORID method today.
Yes.
So can you tell me where did you discover this, and why does it appeal to you? And do you use it in your processes a lot of the time, or have you kind of changed the whole thing for yourself to use differently?
Good question. So ORID, the ORID structure, ORID, and I'll explain that in a minute, is part of sort of a core methodology and a body of knowledge called the technology of participation. And when I started looking for training, so that I had some skill, I thought if you're going to be a facilitator, you better stand on something. When I started looking for some training, that was sort of it was the second program that I discovered. And I loved the model. Like, the model made so much sense to me. And that is now my core methodology. And it's my go-to always. So I'm using it 100% of the time in 100% of the cases of clients. But it's become how I think about thinking too. So it's become a really powerful framework that, I don't know, I hate to say it's my calling because that sounds so weird, but it just really connected for me, and it really felt very natural and intuitive for me.
So tell us about it. How does it work?
Yeah.
And look, you also told Doug from Stories and Strategies a beautiful art story when you're explaining it to him. And I thought that was a really lovely way of doing it as well. Okay,
so let me start there then. So the origins of this particular body of knowledge, and the ORID method in particular, kind of go back to post-Second World War. So there was a fellow who was a chaplain in the army, and when he was coming back post-Second World War, he was trying to help soldiers, well, not just soldiers, but anybody who had a war experience sort of process this horrific thing that they had been a part of. So he had been talking with an art professor, and they talked about how do you experience art? And so when you experience art, it's like a three-way conversation between yourself and that piece of art and the artist. And so the professor said to him, you look at the art to see, what are the colors and the shapes and the symbols. And then you think about, how am I responding to that emotionally? Like, what's my gut response to this? And then you start asking yourself, well, what does this mean? Like, what is the meaning or the significance of this painting for me? And then, or painting or piece of art. And then, your final level of thinking on that is, and so what does it mean for my life, right? And so through this really connected with him because he had studied the phenomenologists and the existentialists in his own career. And so that really connected for him. So he went back to those bodies of knowledge and created this thing we called at the time the art form conversation, which we now call the focus conversation, but it has these 4 levels of thinking, this ORID thinking. And I think what is super cool about that is that that's its origin story. And this is, the 50s, the 60s when it's being codified. But neuroscience now totally backs this model. Like, we didn't have the neuroscience then, but we do now. And it totally supports this model that was created and then used extensively in kind of community development type of activities.
That's amazing, isn't it? To think
It's a cool story, right?
It is.
A super cool story.
And to think that somebody's come up with something that's actually, is proven today is a fantastic thing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Gives a good street cred.
It is. It does. Certainly does. Anything that can be proven these days, great street cred. So let's go through the level,
Let's describe it.
method.
Yeah.
Yep.
So what the model says is that there's 4 levels of thinking, and that we naturally go through 4 levels of thinking, and it can be super fast, like instant, or it can take time. And so the 4 levels sound like this. So the first level is sort of the observational level. We call it the objective level, the O level. And that's really kind of what is the observable data in the space. So in the case of a painting, what colors, what shapes, what images, textures. So it's that observable data. And then the second level of thinking is what we call the reflective level, and that's our internal response to the observable data. And so this is the level, in my opinion, this is the magic in the model, because we actually explore that emotional response of people. And there's a lot of places where we don't like to touch that, so the model pulls that into the mix. And so just from a brain science perspective, that O and the R level are the back of the head stuff, right? Like that's your limbic system at work, where see something, fight or flight, right? That's where all that sits. The third level of the model is what we call the interpretive level, the I level. And at the interpretive level, we start making sense of what we've observed and how we're responding to it. And so this kind of moves to the front of the head in that prefrontal cortex area. And so this is where we sort of, the meaning, the significance, I often call it connecting the dots, figuring out what it all, how it all comes together. And then the final stage of that model is the D level, or the decisional level. And it's bringing that thought pattern to some kind of a conclusion. Like what is the resolution of the thought pattern? And so going through those 4 levels is a very intuitive thing for us, because it's kind of how our brain processes.
And is that what's been proven? That is how the brain processes.
Yeah. We used to have this, we used to think that thought came through the front of our brain, is fully formed because we're this sophisticated beast, right? Turns out
we're not
so
really.
We're not really. That back of the brain stuff, that's what's kept our species alive.
Yes.
And so it's primitive brain or limbic system, whatever you want to call it. But it's, it's that very pay attention to environment, know whether you need to be afraid.
Yes. So if you were using that, have you got a business example, perhaps a bit of something that's happened to you that you can tell us without giving away any data? We use this model with all clients all the time. So we use it in what we call the focus conversation form. So as an example, we're just preparing for something in a couple of days, but there'll be some presentations. There'll be a bunch of presentations that'll happen. And so what we'll do is we'll run a conversation after the presentations. And so that presentation is the objective level of data, right? So there's all this information that's going to be presented. And then the first questions we'll ask will be something like, so what's coming up for you? What surprised you? This is the R level. What's, frustrating about what you've seen, or what's fuzzy or unclear, or what do you have more questions about? And so we'll ask that O and R set of questions. And then when they've done that, we'll say, well, okay, what's important about what's been presented? We're into the I level. What's the significance of this? What does it mean for your community, your organization, your group? And the D level question might sound like, okay, so what's your takeaway on this? What are you guys coming to as a conclusion around this piece of content that's been presented? So that's a very typical conversation. Right. So do you record every process, or, everyone's responses, and does everyone give a response?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as facilitators, we're always trying to balance all the voices in the room. So what we're trying to do is ask, we ask the question like, okay, sometimes you might actually ask every person, okay, what did you notice? Tell me something you highlighted or underlined or whatever at the O level to get every voice in the room. Then we'll ask the R level, and generally speaking, we'll let people respond as appropriate because we're still early in what I'd call the thinking stack. And then we might put some people in small groups at the R level so they can talk sort of more privately about things that worry them. Then we'll go to the I level. We might have an exercise for it, or we might ask that question out loud. And then we'll ask the group to come to some kind of conclusion. So where we often document, and it really depends on your purpose as a facilitator and what you're trying to do in the conversation, is we typically document the I and the D level.
All right. Okay.
Unless it's a conflicted situation where we might document the R level.
Is your business in endless chaos? Are you constantly in a state of self-criticism and unhappiness? Feeling out of control? Well, take back your life. This is something I can help you with. Let me teach you the tools of self-understanding and self-love. You won't look back. Take the first step and email me for a chat at thepersonalitycoach.com.au. Because putting it in a family perspective, we run a business and it's a really, looking at now, a really valuable tool. I love MBTI, so I talk about personalities and preferences, and often the introverts don't actually involve themselves in a conversation like that. So I guess that you have to draw out responses from everybody in different ways. And of course, being an extrovert, which I am, I bowl in and just speak over the top of everybody. So, I'm really aware of how you have to learn to listen. Like you said earlier, it's very, very valuable to do all of that. But in our family, so you talk about, we talked about logic and feeling and what level that comes in at, because I'm in a family of very logical thinkers and I'm a very feeling thinker. And so we have quite a bit of diversity in our conversation all the time. So I'm just wondering what level that comes in, and do you see those different personalities, the Myers-Briggs type personalities, come out in those conversations?
Yeah. Oh, there's a whole bunch of things going on for me in that question. So the model recognizes that everybody goes through these stages of thinking, but they might go through it at different paces and at different stages, right? So when you're facilitating a group, you're trying to bring everyone into the process at different, through the stages, right? And so I'll call it kind of collect them through the process. And so we are intentionally doing things that would appreciate an introverted tendency. Like the introverted tendency might be, okay, everyone, we're going to be quiet for 3 minutes and everyone's just going to think. And then the extroverts will start talking in 30 seconds. And then you say something like, so this is the silent thinking part. Right? And then the extroverts, and you go, okay, extroverts, quiet now. Let's give our introverts some space. So yes, we very much recognize those tendencies. And that's why small group is really important.
It is.
Is so that the introverts can be talking to someone where there's space for them to talk, right? So we're really aware of that. But, as you talk about personality preferences, so, I'm familiar with MBTI. I think I'm an ENTJ, right. I think. Yeah. And my husband is a deep introvert, right? And I have a household of, probably two of the four of us are probably pretty big introverts, and two of us are more extroverted. And so what you realize through personality is people have preferences for how they behave, and people also have preferences for where they like to think. And so the power of running people through an ORID structure is that you can nudge them to think in different places than what they would normally think. So my deeply logical, deeply introverted husband, who when you ask a question is silent for some time and then comes out with a fully formed solution, what I might do with him is say, okay, so I just asked you a question. So what are you curious about, or what are you surprised about? Or he'll describe his day to me and I'll say, well, tell me what you liked about that, or tell me what is frustrating about that. What I have noticed with him, because it's not where he thinks typically, is he really likes that question. Right? Like it allows him to say things that he might be thinking about, but hasn't articulated to himself. And so I find that just by asking, so do you hold people in the stages of the process gently, and you encourage them to think in each stage of that process. And then people who have particular strengths, so let's say those logical thinkers, they'll show up at the analytical stage, at the interpretive stage, and they'll be the ones with, well, I think we could do this option A or option B or option C. And those people who have the sort of that, I'll call it that more emotional state. They'll show up when you ask the question, okay, what did we do before, and what didn't work before, and what might work now? And so they'll show up really well there. And so with the group, you respect that you'll have different people talking at different stages in that process, and that's perfect because they're talking according to their strengths.
Yes. And are they encouraged to listen to the other? I find. Yeah.
My favorite exercise with extroverts is to ask them to just listen to someone for 2 minutes without interrupting.
I do a listening exercise where I say, well, actually, it's purely for listening, and that they're not allowed to talk about themselves for 3 minutes, and they have to ask the other person questions about themselves. Oh, massive struggle.
It makes them work hard. It does.
It sure does. And it's really interesting because the thinking person's opinion, to me, a lot of the time, they're just thinking they're right the whole time, no matter what you express, whatever they have thought in their heads. They think, well, really, that's okay, but I am correct. I find that empathetic language in workshops that I've used, for example, a group of accountants, all ISTJ, and I was banging on with feeling and telling them they needed to put themselves in someone else's shoes, and one of them put their hand up and said, "You mean manipulate them?" And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I'm using the wrong language. I'm speaking. So do you change the way you talk to your people too?
Yeah, I do think about that. So I work with lots of engineers often. So I won't ask them a question of, what is, I wouldn't ask them a question of, what's exciting about that? No. I would say, what do you like? Yeah. Right. And so I would temper language for that group.
Yes.
What I will also say is when we're working with groups, you get to something like the eye level, and if you can make the process visible, through whatever we do, we put on the wall, however we do that, boy, do they appreciate that. And for those who are the more visual thinkers, then they're like, oh, I could see it. That was so helpful. I could see what we were talking about. Right.
Yes. Because the intuitive flying off, I'm sensing your intuitive flying off on tangent, yes, is such a hard thing for the sensing person too.
I'll just throw a plug in there. I've been working with some First Nations recently, and they're super great in abstraction and concept, right? Because they think in stories and talk in stories. And so what we were trying to do with them was taking a plan and putting it into tactics and initiatives. And that's quite hard for them. It's not how they think. But what we context it with is, you guys are super strong at the conceptual, but it's really hard to manage a project through abstraction. So let's get some detail on the wall so that you can manage this project. So you have a better idea, a more concrete understanding of what the project is, right? But it's not how they like to think. It's not their sort of their intuitive way of thinking.
No, and it's not their strength. And I have an intuitive brother who says, Kate, you can get me partway down those stairs, but I'm not getting to the bottom. He says he gets bored once he starts coming off his big picture. I visually draw a staircase when I run my workshops and say, you've got your sensing types down the bottom and your intuitive big pictures up the top. The sensing people can usually make it to the top if they're stepped up, but the big picture people often, they really need to.
It's hard work to be an N and get to to get to the bottom. It's hard, right? Yeah. I often say that. I'm like, I'm not good at detail. I can do it, but it's really hard work for me to do detail.
And it's really lucky that you're a J, because I think the P's just give up. It's like, forget it. It just doesn't happen. But it's really fascinating in that kind of conversation, because I've looked at it and thought, oh, I wonder if I can try this with my family. So I thought, well, since you got adult children, my thing is I bowl into a discussion like, let's look at this. I've got adult children who are 30 and 28, and I hope they're not going to listen to this podcast, because a lot of the time they pretend to listen to my podcast, but I don't think they really do. So adult children are home so much more these days. So getting them to involve themselves in the household chores, if you haven't already done that, right? And I've been a bit of a steamroller parent. I've got great kids, but I think my husband and I have certainly helped them along the way. So sitting them down to have a conversation to say, hey, listen, you're going to be here for a while, so let's change the dynamic of a household. How how would I do that? Just as an
start that
example,
conversation?
how would you start that conversation?
Yeah. So a conversation structure might go something like, okay, let's describe all of the things that we have to do around this house on a daily basis or a weekly basis or whatever, right? So let's describe the tasks and the activities. And which ones of these do you really hate doing? And which one of these do you actually like doing? And what's the state of, like, how frustrated can you be about this kind of work, right? And then, once you really explore the R level, because so much sits in the R and so much is underexplored in the R level, right? So if people are really frustrated, then it's important to let all of that stuff out. So as a little kid, when little kids come home and they're, you really want to help them through that level. So even with your adult children, okay, guys, like, and then, so Mom, what's frustrating about that? Well, what's frustrating for me is that I feel like the help when I got to do all this stuff, right? I too am working. I too have things, blah, blah, blah. I feel like the help, right? And so everybody gets that on, and you make sure that everybody has a chance at the R level. And then you can start getting to, okay, so guys, so what does this mean for how we are together? And what are some options for us? And what's the downside of us staying in the status quo? And what's the upside of us solving it? So what can we do? Right? And it can sound like that.
Yep.
I mean, it's a bit contrived. You have to be, as I always say, gentle with the process with your own family, because otherwise you get something like this: Mom, stop using your work stuff on me.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes. But even if I framed it, we're going to try the conversation this way, rather than sit there and go, oh, for goodness sake, could you pick up your bath mat again? That doesn't work either, does it? It just
really
ends
doesn't.
up.
I always say to my clients, nobody likes being handed a to-do list, so you better involve the people that you want to do the work in deciding what the to-do list is.
Yes.
Right.
So interpretive, you'd sit there and discuss how you might solve this. Is that where you would do it?
Yeah, and also, before I even went to solutioning, let's talk about the impacts of us as 4 adults living in this house at odds with each other over domestic duties. Like, what is this going to do to our relationships? How do we feel about this when things go sideways like this, right? What does it mean for, the way or how we feel about coming into the house every day? Like, I would go into what are the implications of the status quo before I ask them to, okay, so what do you want to do about that? How do we do this better as 4 adults so that we're not at each other's throats and can enjoy each other and don't trip over the, school bags at the door or whatever it is.
Yeah. Great advice. Thank you. I'm going to replay this podcast so I can listen to you say that again before I sit down and do it. Because it is, stuff like that, even with adult children. I mean, I speak a lot to people who have young children and talk about talking to the feelings and stuff like that, which is really, really important these days, which I never really did as a mother in the early years. I think I made it through, and my kids like me. So, I think that's a bonus. But it is that even as an adult child, I read a book called How to Listen to Your Kids So They'll Talk, and How to Talk So Your Kids Will Listen. And even as an adult child, what I did discover, and I don't know whether this is even part of that, was that my son would come in and he'd say, I hate work, can't stand it. And my reaction would be, oh, no, you don't. You've got a good life. How can you hate work? That's ridiculous. And when I read this book, I changed it to, must be pretty bad. That's how tough for you. Biggest light globe bulb moment in my life has been that conversation, and I think that that's what you must use in this a lot too. Yeah,
in fact, I think the first question I might say is, tell me more about that.
Okay.
And the second question I might ask would be, so what is it that you really don't like about it? And then tell me why you don't like it. What is it about it that is challenging for you? Excellent. And really unpacking that, what we call the R level. The workplace parallels. Workplace is really hostile to emotion generally. And so we bring those patterns home. And then we are sort of, come on, just be a good kid. Like, stop being a brat, right? And I think, I was thinking about this today. I think that book, I don't know I think it was called The Best Baby or something like that. And, I read that years ago when my kids were little. And I think the gist of that is that you mirror the intensity of the emotion that your children are demonstrating so that they understand that they have been acknowledged. And, this model kind of does that, but in a language way, which is to say, what bugs you about that, right? Or what's exciting about that? What are you thrilled about, right? And by asking those, what we call the R-level questions, you draw on that really big part of ourselves that we don't actually use very effectively very often. And so, we always say you don't ask how you feel, we ask what the emotion is. And then you just get really useful information, right? So whether I'm working with a corporate group or whether I'm working with my own kids, I get really good information from questions like, okay, well, what are you afraid of? Or what are you worried about, right? What's the worst thing that can happen?
Yeah. And it does bring out that's a great way of unpacking. I mean, I try to unpack, but I think that's a really good way of unpacking, because I usually by the time I have finished that conversation without unpacking as well as you do, he does say, it wasn't really that bad. He starts to find the good in the bad, which is good.
Well, we often, so when we teach the model, because I also teach this methodology, when we teach it, we talk about, we've chased emotion away. But if you think of emotion as data, as useful data, especially in the workplace, then you've got really good stuff to pull into it, right? And so it's just so, if you think of it as this is how I get good data. And by the way, this is really, this is the lived experience component of us. This is pulling on our lived experiences. Then it's really useful information, and then not to be afraid of it that way.
Fantastic information. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It is really interesting. I just think the older I get, the more I learn. I just wish I had all of this knowledge when I was young.
No kidding, right?
But,
don't you wish you knew how to? I often say, God, I wish I knew this when I was leading teams 20 years ago. Or I wish I knew this when my kids were little 15 years ago, right?
I know. And all you can do is put into play now. And it's never too late. It's never too late to use any of this in life. I mean, my children are pretty well versed in personality. So, I mean, they roll their eyes as soon as I start. But they actually
my
use...
kids do too.
Yeah, but I can imagine that they probably go away and use what you have taught them. Because mine utilise it. My daughter's got her own small business, and she works it with her clientele as to whether... Because she's a perceiving type, not a judging, and she'll work out whether they're judging or perceiving type and how fast she gets her information back to them, what kind of leeway she's got around things, whether they're an introvert and extrovert, and how she speaks to them. And so she does actually use it, even though it has infiltrated, even though they might sit there and give you a hard time. It is happening, So yes, wisdom is wonderful.
Well, and it's interesting. My daughter is working on a mental health crisis hotline these days, right? As part of her studies. And so I hear her training, and I've heard her talking about her training, and it's just so much about empathy and compassion and understanding and drawing out the emotion and drawing out the feeling and drawing out the concern, right? So it's been really interesting to hear her go through her training, and I see, this underlying thinking pattern hard at work with a heavy emphasis on that R level, because it's a mental health crisis line.
And what a great skill she's learning at that age.
I think she's quite brilliant, and I'm not sure I get any credit for that. So.
No, I'm sure you do. Take all the credit you can. No one else will give it to you, Robin. May as well take everything. Oh no, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your experience and wonderful knowledge of me today. It's been great talking to you.
Yes, likewise. I've loved it. Thank you so much for inviting me onto your show.
Overall, achieving group agreement and harmony requires a combination of effective communication, shared vision, mutual respect, collaborative decision-making, conflict resolution skills, trust, accountability, celebration of diversity, and a commitment to ongoing evaluation and feedback. This obviously takes skill and practice, but it's seriously worth investing the time to practice the steps and build familiarity with the ORID framework. These are the parenting tweaks and takeaways that, if we invest some of our time in now, can save us so much relationship grief later. I'm Kate Mason. Thank you for listening to Parenting and Personalities. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you could leave a rating and a review that would help others learn about this podcast. If you're interested in discovering more about you and your family's personality types, you'll find my book, Who Is This Monster or Treasure in My House, on Booktopia or Amazon. If you have an episode idea, please send a note to thepersonalitycoach@gmail.com. Many thanks to our producers at Stories and Strategies, and we'll see you next time.